The early morning light filtered through the blinds of Elizabeth Morgan's Manhattan apartment, casting soft shadows across the nursery walls. At 53, Elizabeth cradled her 3-month-old daughter Sophia in her arms, rocking gently in the chair her husband David had insisted on buying despite its exorbitant price. "Only the best for our little miracle," he'd said, his eyes shining with the kind of joy Elizabeth had once thought would never be hers to witness. As Sophia's tiny fingers curled around her mother's thumb, Elizabeth marveled at the journey that had brought her here, a path marked by decades of longing, heartbreak, and finally, against all odds, the child she had almost stopped believing could exist. 25 years earlier, Elizabeth had been a rising star at one of New York's most prestigious architectural firms. At 28, she was driven, ambitious, and entirely focused on shattering the glass ceiling that had kept so many talented women from achieving their potential in her field. Romance was the furthest thing from her mind when she literally bumped into James Porter in the university library, where she was researching historical preservation techniques for an upcoming project. James was a professor of architectural history, 10 years her senior, with kind eyes and a laugh that seemed to start somewhere deep in his chest before erupting in rich, warm tones that made Elizabeth smile despite herself. What began as an academic discussion about Gothic revivalism somehow evolved into dinner, which turned into a whirlwind romance that surprised no one more than Elizabeth herself. Within a year, they were married in a small ceremony at the New York Public Library, surrounded by books and loved ones. They bought a brownstone in Brooklyn, renovating it together on weekends, arguing passionately about design choices before compromising in ways that ultimately made the space better than either had envisioned alone. When Elizabeth turned 30, they decided to start a family. "We'll have brilliant, stubborn children," James would joke, "with your eye for detail and my historical perspective." Elizabeth had laughed, but privately she'd always harbored doubts about motherhood. Not because she didn't want children, but because she worried her ambition would make her a less present parent than she wanted to be. James had assured her they would figure it out together, but after a year of trying without success, the first shadow fell across their happy life. Tests revealed that Elizabeth had severe endometriosis, significantly reducing her chances of conception. What followed was a blur of specialists, procedures, hormone treatments, and crushing disappointment month after month. James remained steadfast, holding Elizabeth through nights of silent tears and days of pasted-on smiles. "We have options," he would say, "and whatever happens, we have each other." But Elizabeth could see the longing in his eyes when they passed playgrounds, or when their friends brought new babies to dinner parties. After 3 years of fertility treatments, including 2 failed rounds of IVF that drained their savings and Elizabeth's emotional reserves, the final blow came. At 34, Elizabeth was diagnosed with a rare form of ovarian cancer that required immediate and extensive surgery. The procedure saved her life, but eliminated any remaining chance of carrying a child. The grief nearly broke them. Elizabeth withdrew into herself, throwing herself into her work with a fervor that worried James. He suggested adoption, but Elizabeth couldn't bear to begin another journey that might end in heartbreak. Slowly, a distance grew between them. Not from lack of love, but from the weight of dreams deferred and the different ways they each carried their sorrow. 7 years into their marriage, James died suddenly of an aneurysm while lecturing his class. Elizabeth found herself a widow at 35, with a cavernous emptiness where her future had once been. The double loss of both her husband and the family they had hoped to create left her adrift in a world that suddenly seemed meaningless. For the next decade, Elizabeth lived a life carefully constructed to avoid reminders of what she had lost. She sold the brownstone, moved to a sleek, modern apartment in Manhattan, and channeled all her energy into her career. She became the youngest partner in her firm's history, known for her brilliant designs and exacting standards. If colleagues noticed how she avoided the firm's family events or how she worked through holidays, they were tactful enough not to mention it. It was at 45 that Elizabeth took on the project that would change the course of her life, the restoration of a historic theater in San Francisco. The building was a magnificent example of Art Deco architecture that had fallen into disrepair, and the committee overseeing its resurrection had specifically requested Elizabeth after seeing her work on similar projects. During her initial visit to the site, she met Marcus Wright, the 30-year-old structural engineer assigned to the project. With his warm brown skin, thoughtful gray eyes, and unexpected passion for preserving the theater's original character, Marcus immediately stood out from the construction professionals Elizabeth typically encountered. "This ceiling mural is original to 1928, he told her during their first walkthrough, pointing to faded figures barely visible beneath years of smoke damage and neglect. "I've been researching restoration techniques that could bring it back without compromising the integrity of the structure." Elizabeth had been impressed by his initiative, but maintained her professional distance. She had learned long ago to keep relationships with colleagues strictly professional. But over the following months, as they worked closely together navigating the complex challenges of the restoration, she found Marcus increasingly difficult to categorize merely as a colleague. He challenged her ideas respectfully but directly, offered innovative solutions to structural problems that threatened her design vision, and, most disarmingly, seemed genuinely interested in her perspective beyond the immediate requirements of the project. "You've been doing this for what, 20 years?" he asked her one evening as they reviewed plans over takeout in the temporary site office. "What's the most important thing you've learned?" The question caught Elizabeth off guard. Most people asked about her most prestigious projects or her design philosophy, not what she had learned. "That building's outlast us," she said after a moment's reflection. "If we're lucky, what we create will stand long after we're gone, telling stories about who we were and what we valued." Marcus had nodded slowly. "That's why this matters so much," he said, gesturing to the plans spread between them. "We're not just fixing an old building, we're preserving a piece of collective memory." It was the first time in years that Elizabeth had felt truly seen, not as the accomplished architect or the widow or the woman who couldn't have children, but as someone whose values and thoughts mattered in their own right. Their professional relationship gradually evolved into friendship. Elizabeth found herself accepting Marcus's invitations to explore San Francisco's architectural landmarks on weekends, sharing meals where conversation extended far beyond work, and eventually confiding aspects of her past she had kept carefully guarded for years. When the theater project concluded, Elizabeth returned to New York with a promotion, accolades for the successful restoration, and an emptiness she hadn't expected to feel. Her correspondence with Marcus continued, first about professional matters, then expanding to include books they were reading, exhibits they had visited, and increasingly the personal philosophies that shaped their approaches to life. 6 months after her return to New York, Marcus called with news that he had been offered a position with a prestigious engineering firm in Manhattan. "Would it be strange if I called you when I arrive?" he asked, his voice carrying a note of uncertainty she hadn't heard before. "For recommendations about neighborhoods, of course." Elizabeth smiled into the phone. "Of course," she said. "That would be perfectly reasonable." Marcus moved to New York, and their friendship deepened. Elizabeth introduced him to her favorite hidden architectural gems in the city, while he brought a fresh perspective that challenged her long-held assumptions. At 47, Elizabeth found herself laughing more than she had in years, rediscovering parts of herself she had thought were permanently lost after James's death. It was Marcus who first acknowledged the shift in their relationship during a walk through Central Park as autumn painted the trees in brilliant oranges and reds. "I need to tell you something," he said, stopping beside the lake where model sailboats drifted lazily across the water. "I value our friendship too much to risk it with uncertainty, but I also respect you too much to be anything less than honest." Elizabeth felt a flutter of anxiety. In her experience, such preambles rarely preceded good news. "I have feelings for you," Marcus continued, his eyes steady on hers. "Not just friendship or professional admiration, though those are certainly part of it. I find myself thinking about you when we're apart, looking forward to the moments when I'll see you again. I understand if you don't feel the same way, or if the age difference—" 15 years is significant, Elizabeth interrupted, her practical nature asserting itself despite the unexpected warmth spreading through her chest. "It is," Marcus agreed. "And I've thought about that. I've thought about a lot of things. Your career, my career, what people might say. But ultimately, all I know is that when I'm with you, I feel more fully myself than I ever have with anyone else." Elizabeth looked at this man, 15 years her junior, at the beginning of his career while she was approaching its pinnacle, with decades of life ahead of him that she had already lived, and saw not just what was, but what could be. "I need time," she said finally. "This isn't something I ever expected." Marcus nodded. "Take all the time you need. I'll be here." For weeks, Elizabeth wrestled with her feelings. She made pro and con lists, researched psychological studies on age gap relationships, and even consulted a therapist to ensure she wasn't simply seeking to fill the void left by James. But in quieter moments, she acknowledged the truth she was trying so hard to rationalize. She had fallen in love with Marcus. When she finally invited him to dinner at her apartment and confessed her feelings, the joy that transformed his face made her wonder why she had hesitated for so long. Their relationship progressed with the thoughtful deliberation characteristic of them both. They discussed the practical challenges they would face, from career trajectories to family planning to societal judgment, with honesty and care. Elizabeth was particularly concerned about the latter. "You should know what you're getting into," she told Marcus one evening. "People will make assumptions. They'll say I'm having a midlife crisis, or that you're looking for a mother figure, or worse." Marcus took her hand. "Let them talk," he said simply. "We know the truth." And talk they did. When Elizabeth and Marcus began appearing together at professional events, she could feel the curious glances, hear the whispered comments. Even her closest friends expressed concerns, couched in well-meaning phrases like, "just looking out for you," and "don't want to see you get hurt when he eventually wants children." That particular concern echoed Elizabeth's deepest fear, that Marcus, not yet 40, would someday regret choosing a relationship with a woman whose reproductive years were behind her. Though they had discussed it extensively, with Marcus insisting that biological children weren't a priority for him, the worry lingered in Elizabeth's mind. Despite these challenges, their relationship flourished. They moved in together after a year, merging Marcus's minimalist modern furniture with Elizabeth's more eclectic collection in a spacious loft in Tribeca. They established routines that honored both their individual needs and their connection: quiet mornings with coffee and newspapers, vibrant dinner discussions about their respective projects, weekend explorations of architectural sites throughout the Northeast. It was during one such exploration, on Elizabeth's 50th birthday, that Marcus proposed. They were visiting Fallingwater, Frank Lloyd Wright's masterpiece in Pennsylvania, and had just stepped onto one of the cantilevered terraces extending over the waterfall when Marcus dropped to one knee. "I know you don't need a piece of paper to validate what we have," he said, holding up a simple platinum band. "But I want the world to know that I choose you, Elizabeth Morgan, exactly as you are, for as long as you'll have me." Elizabeth, who prided herself on her composure in all situations, found herself speechless. When she finally managed to say yes, the few tourists sharing the terrace with them broke into spontaneous applause. They married in a small ceremony at the San Francisco Theater where they had met, now fully restored to its original glory. Elizabeth wore a sleek ivory suit rather than a traditional gown, and Marcus beamed as she walked toward him down the aisle. Their respective families were cautiously supportive, if somewhat bemused by the match. It was 3 months after their wedding, during a routine physical examination, that Elizabeth received the news that would once again alter the course of her life. What her doctor initially suspected might be early signs of menopause turned out to be something much more unexpected. Elizabeth was pregnant. "This is extremely rare," her doctor explained, clearly as shocked as Elizabeth herself. "Given your medical history and age, the odds of natural conception were virtually non-existent. I need to be clear that this will be classified as a very high-risk pregnancy with significant potential complications for both you and the fetus." Elizabeth left the doctor's office in a daze, unsure whether to feel elation or terror. She had long ago accepted that motherhood was not in her future. She had grieved that loss, made peace with it, built a life that was fulfilling without children. And yet now, at 50, she found herself facing the very possibilities she had once wanted so desperately. When she told Marcus that evening, his initial shock quickly gave way to cautious joy. "Whatever you decide," he assured her, "I'm with you completely." Elizabeth spent days researching the risks of pregnancy at her age, consulting specialists, and deeply examining her own feelings. The potential complications were daunting: increased risks of miscarriage, chromosomal abnormalities, gestational diabetes, preeclampsia, and other conditions that could endanger both her and the baby. Yet, beneath the fear and practical concerns, Elizabeth found a quiet certainty growing within her, matching the tiny life taking shape against all odds. This child, this miracle she had never expected, was a chance she wanted to take. The pregnancy was as difficult as her doctors had warned. Elizabeth suffered from severe morning sickness well into her second trimester, developed gestational diabetes that required constant monitoring, and was placed on bed rest at 30 weeks when her blood pressure rose dangerously. She had to step back from active work at her firm, managing projects remotely when her health permitted, and reluctantly delegating responsibilities she would normally have handled personally. Throughout it all, Marcus was her constant support, adjusting his work schedule to attend every medical appointment, researching nutritional requirements for high-risk pregnancies, and creating a calm environment at home that helped mitigate the stress of her condition. Not everyone was as supportive. Medical professionals occasionally made insensitive comments about grandmothers in the maternity ward, and strangers often assumed Marcus was her son when they attended prenatal classes together. Even some friends expressed concerns that bordered on judgment, questioning whether having a child at her age was fair to the baby. "They'll have older parents," one friend pointed out during a particularly difficult conversation. "Have you thought about what that means for the child's future?" "We've thought about little else," Marcus replied with unusual sharpness. "We've also thought about the stability we can provide, the wisdom of our years, and the absolute certainty that this child is wanted and loved beyond measure." As Elizabeth's due date approached, the criticism faded into background noise against the reality of their impending parenthood. They prepared the nursery in their loft, attended parenting classes, and made legal arrangements to ensure the child's future security, regardless of what might happen to them. At 38 weeks, Elizabeth developed preeclampsia, necessitating an emergency C-section. The delivery was fraught with complications, and there were moments when the medical team feared for both Elizabeth's and the baby's survival. But after hours of tension and uncertainty, Sophia James Wright entered the world, tiny but healthy, with a strong cry that brought tears to her parents' eyes. Elizabeth's recovery was slow. The physical toll of the pregnancy and delivery at her age was substantial, requiring an extended hospital stay and weeks of limited mobility afterward. Yet, even in her most exhausted moments, she felt a profound gratitude that overshadowed the discomfort. When she held Sophia against her chest, feeling the rapid flutter of her daughter's heartbeat, Elizabeth knew with absolute certainty that every difficulty had been worthwhile. Marcus took an extended leave from work to care for both Elizabeth and Sophia during those early months, displaying a natural ease with the baby that Elizabeth sometimes envied as she struggled with the physical limitations of her recovery. But gradually, they developed rhythms and routines that worked for their family, discovering together the joys and challenges of parenthood. Sophia's first smile, first laugh, first successful night's sleep, each milestone was celebrated with an intensity born of the knowledge of how precious and improbable her existence was. Elizabeth found herself storing away these moments like treasures, aware that she might not have as many years with her daughter as younger mothers would. "I worry sometimes," she confessed to Marcus one night, as they watched Sophia sleeping in her crib, "about not being here to see her grow up fully, about leaving you both too soon." Marcus wrapped his arms around her waist, resting his chin on her shoulder. "None of us knows how much time we have," he said quietly. "James taught you that. All we can do is love her fiercely while we're here and make sure she always knows how wanted she was." As Sophia grew from newborn to infant, Elizabeth gradually returned to work, though with a modified schedule that allowed her to be present for her daughter in ways she had once thought impossible. To her surprise, motherhood didn't diminish her professional passion, but rather gave it new dimension. She found herself thinking more about how the spaces she designed would be experienced by families, by children, by people at all stages of life's journey. Now, rocking 3-month-old Sophia in the early morning light, Elizabeth reflected on the path that had brought her here. She thought of James, who had wanted children so badly, but hadn't lived to see this miracle. She thought of the decades she had spent believing motherhood was impossible for her. She thought of Marcus, who had seen her completely and loved her exactly as she was, opening her heart to possibilities she had long since abandoned. Sophia stirred in her arms, her tiny face scrunching briefly before settling back into peaceful sleep. At 53, Elizabeth knew the road ahead would not be easy. She would be 68 when Sophia graduated high school, 72 when she finished college. There would be challenges unique to their family structure, questions they would need to answer with honesty and care as Sophia grew old enough to understand the unusual circumstances of her birth. But looking down at her daughter's face, a perfect blend of her own features and Marcus's, Elizabeth felt a peace she had never expected to find. This was not the life she had planned, not the family she had once envisioned, but it was infinitely precious precisely because of its improbability. From the doorway came the soft sound of movement. Elizabeth looked up to see Marcus watching them, his face tender in the golden morning light. "You should be sleeping," she whispered, careful not to disturb Sophia. "I woke up and you were gone," he said simply, crossing the room to kneel beside the rocking chair. He reached out to gently stroke Sophia's cheek with one finger. "Besides, I didn't want to miss this." Elizabeth understood exactly what he meant. Every moment with their daughter felt like a gift, one they had never expected to receive, and therefore valued beyond measure. The world might not understand their family, might question their choices, or predict difficulties ahead, but in this quiet morning moment, with Sophia sleeping peacefully between them, none of that mattered. "Thank you," Elizabeth said softly, looking into Marcus's eyes. "For what?" "For seeing possibilities I couldn't see. For loving me enough to build this life together." She glanced down at Sophia. "For her?" Marcus smiled, taking Elizabeth's free hand in his. "Thank you for being brave enough to take the chance," he replied. "On me, on us, on all of it." Outside their window, New York was coming awake, the early sun glinting off glass towers and casting long shadows across the streets below. Another day was beginning, one of thousands they had already shared and countless more they hoped to experience together. Their story wasn't conventional by any standard, but it was theirs, a testament to the unpredictable nature of love and the miraculous possibilities that remain open to those brave enough to embrace them, regardless of age or circumstance. As Sophia sighed contentedly in her sleep, Elizabeth leaned her head against Marcus's shoulder and closed her eyes, allowing herself to simply exist in the perfect improbability of their family's love.